I write poetry and short fiction as well as nonfiction. I've been fortunate enough to have had my work published in numerous magazines and journals. I've also written several novels. The first of my mystery series is coming out in January of 2023. So today I would like to bring up my presentation if I can here. I would like to guide you through the process of getting your own poetry, your own work into literary journals. All right. So I'm just going to be sharing my own experiences on how to get your work published and into literary magazines. I've been doing this for about 3.5 years now. So you may be at different at different points in your writing career, or whether you're writing as a hobby, whatever. You may never have been published before, or some of you may have had work published numerous times, but wherever you are in that process, I'm hoping that you'll get something out of this. So I'm going to guide you through the process, beginning with, first of all, the first thing that you should do when you're submitting your work is, of course, you need to be familiar with poetry and the type of poetry that is being published. So if you have written some poems and you're wondering what to do with them, well, you could keep them to yourself for your own enjoyment, or you could share them with your family and your friends, or something we would all like to do is to send them out to share them with other people who enjoy poetry as much as we do. So as I've said before, the first thing that I think you should do is to read poetry. Begin with some online journals. A lot of these are free to read, so you should be able to familiarize yourself with what's out there before you go ahead and submit your own work. So check out some online magazines and then do your own writing. So write and prepare your own poems for submission. The poems that you've read in other magazines will give you an idea of the type of work that these individual magazines are interested in printing in their journals. I would suggest that you have more than just a few poems, at least a dozen or so before submitting. And you should organize those. I organize in several ways. One thing that I do is organize by theme. So for example, I would organize it by, is it dark poetry or humorous? Is it seasonal poetry? Are you writing poems about relationships or about identity? Are they nature poems? They may be poems about specific seasons, specific holidays like Halloween or Christmas. You can also organize your poetry by the theme by the type or the style of poem. For example, it may be free verse. It may be free verse or blank verse, or it might be a little more structured, like rhyming poems or sonnets. And you can find all different types of poetry, different genres of poetry, and themes for poetry online. So familiarize yourself with what's out there before you go ahead and submit your own. Now, once you have a group of poems ready to submit, it's not quite ready yet because, as I think we've heard before, editing is a big part of the process. So do you think you have your poem ready to go out? I would suggest that you go over it again and again before you submit. So the first thing to check would be the basic things like your spelling, your punctuation, grammar. Check the vocabulary that you've used, your sentence structure. You might want to revise the content to make sure that you've clarified the message that you want to get out there. Read it out loud, listen to the rhythm, the rhyme, pattern, line structure, your word choice. And then ask for someone else to read it and to listen to it. Another set of eyes and ears is always crucial to making sure that your work is ready to be submitted. So once they're polished and you're ready to submit, I would suggest that you would submit them to several magazines at once, unless a particular magazine says that they do not accept simultaneous submissions. And we'll come to that later on. While you're waiting to hear back about your submissions, you're going to be reading more poetry, writing more poetry, and hopefully as you're going through this process, you're going to eventually find success. And at that point, you're just going to continue on the process and keep publishing. You are not a good fit. Get used to it. You're probably going to be hearing that a lot. Getting published isn't easy, but it is possible and you can do it. You're just going to need a really thick skin because rejection is a big part of the process. And yet the only way to get your work accepted for publication is to accept the fact that you're going to be rejected a lot. But that's okay. It's perfectly normal. And the thing is, it does get easier as time goes on. After your first publication, you're going to receive some validation that, hey, my work is worth publishing. Someone else felt that it was worth putting in their magazine and felt that it was something that other people would be interested in reading. However, I would say that you should consider, before you go ahead and submit, you should consider how important is publication to you? And are you willing to put up with the rejection? Are you willing to put up with the effort and deal with the ups and downs of being a published writer? So if you've decided that you want to publish poetry because this is your hobby and you have this collection of thoughts and ideas and feelings that you're really excited about and you want to share with other people, you hope that they're going to enjoy your work. Well, that's great, because I think that's a really good reason to try to get your work out there. You might want the thrill of having people see your name and your work out there in print, seeing that yourself and sharing that with other people, and that's also great. But I would suggest that if you're doing this for the money, that you're going to be very disappointed with that, because most journals don't pay for your work, for your poetry. They may offer a small token payment, or you might get a free issue of the magazine where your work appears. You might get a year's subscription. But most often, you're going to receive the honor of having your work published. And although that might not pay in a monetary way immediately, it can lead to future writing opportunities. And many literary magazines nominate their writers for awards, and these awards can come with monetary prizes. Being published in a prestigious magazine or being nominated for and perhaps winning an award looks really good on your bio and your resume if you're hoping to pursue a career path in writing. So once you've made that commitment and you're ready to submit your work, you decided this is what you want to do, you want to share it, you need to have a list, magazines that might be interested in your work. So where do you begin this hunt? Well, fortunately, there are hundreds and even thousands of places that publish poetry. And you're going to find these by looking online, doing your own search, looking through tracking sites, checking out websites that list periodicals, and by joining social media groups. You're going to choose the magazines that suit your writing style the best and offer you the best chance of publication. So a good place to begin your search for magazines to publish your work is simply by doing an online search. This is something that you can explore on your own time. I would suggest that some of the keywords and phrases that you use are submit poems, poetry submissions, literary magazines, and then you can add the genre of poetry that you're looking to place. So the types of genres that you might want to look for are horror, sci-fi, fantasy, speculative, humor, romance, whatever is applicable to the work that you're writing. You can search your poems by your poem's theme. For example, you might find magazines that are currently accepting work for spring or Easter. You might be looking for a place to publish your Halloween poetry or Christmas poetry. You could search for seasonal poetry such as summer. You might look for dark poetry, nature poetry, mental health poetry. Remember always as you're doing the search to add submissions or submit to your search. So I've listed here some specific places that I've used, specific websites that list literary magazines. And you want to keep in mind that these aren't always up to date, so it's up to you to check them out. Some of the magazines listed are not even in existence any longer, or they might not take new submissions. So check them out carefully. Check out each individual one to see, are they currently accepting work for publication? So what I'm going to do is, if you want these shared later on, I can do that. Right now, I'm just going to list what they are. If you want to jot them down, the first one there is called Poets and Writers. And when you're searching on that website, you can narrow things down to the genre and even the subgenre of work that you want to submit. Another website where you can find find a listing of literary magazines is called New Pages. Another is Every Writer's Resource. And you may also find some other interesting information there about writing, as well as a list of magazines. A Canadian site is CBC Books. BookFox is another site that lists, I think, the 100 top literary magazines. And another one, which I haven't looked at too much, is called Nonconformist. So those are a few different sites where you can, to go onto those sites, you can Google them, go onto them, and then from there, check out which magazines you're interested in and have a look at their websites. So you'll also discover more sites like this when you do your own search for literary magazines. There's lots of them. Okay, so another place where you can look, when you're online, you will find sites that track submissions as well as places to submit. So one of these places is called Submittable. Submittable is where you would send your poetry to submit to various literary journals. They don't all use it, but a lot do. It also keeps track for you, not just of where and when and what you submitted, but it also organizes your work for you. So it will tell you what is still actively being considered, what has been declined, and what's been accepted. Now, if you click the Discover section on Submittable, you'll also find a list of magazines that you could submit to. Another spot that I find quite useful is called the Submission Grinder. So it's a great resource for finding magazines. And if you use the search function, you can narrow down the type of magazine that you're looking for. And when you click on the name of each of the magazines that you're interested in, you'll find that there's more information about each one. It will show you how to get to the spot where you would put your submission in. It has a listing of different genres that you can submit to. The one site that I use the most is called Duotrope. Now this one unfortunately does have a monthly fee. I find that it's worth it. It's about I think it's $7 Canadian, so it's not a lot. The good thing is that you can try it for 1 month. It's a monthly fee, so try it for 1 month and see if that's of interest to you. As I said, I find that it puts me in touch with a lot of magazines I hadn't heard of before. So this is great because it will track your submissions. It will provide places for you to submit. It will give you information and data about each magazine. So the type of data that I found really interesting is when I'm looking for a magazine that will publish my type of work. So for example, if I'm looking for poetry and it's horror poetry, it will narrow down which are the magazines that accept that type of work. And then I can have a look at each individual magazine that I might be interested in. It will also tell me there under the data, it tells me, do they respond? What percent of people do they respond to? And it also tells me, which I find really helpful, what percent of submissions do they accept? So when you get in there and you're finding, oh, well, this magazine takes like 0.01% of the submissions, for me, that's a place that I probably won't be submitting. If it tells you this place will take 30% of submissions, then I think, okay, maybe I do have a chance there. So I find that's a really useful tool to look on Duotrope and check out for each magazine, what amount of submissions do they actually take and publish. So something else that's really good there is they have a section called under reports. There are sections where it's listed as which magazines are the most approachable, which are the fastest to respond, and so on. As well, it lists what magazines, what time magazines are open or closed for submissions. And it notifies you of new magazines under the publishing news. And that's very helpful because often these new magazines are a lot more accepting of new work from new poets and new writers than the ones that are long established. So I find it worth the investment of money. So that's something you can think about if you want to put in a little bit of money each month to track your submissions and to help you find places to submit. But as I said, that's not necessary. There are other places like Submission Grinder is great and you don't need to pay, or just do your own online searching. So another way to find places to submit is to join social media groups that are focused on writing. So you can find these if you're on Facebook, you can find these if you go into the search bar and type in things like writing group. I've put in submissions, calls for submissions, beta readers, critique partners. There's a Submit Club for submissions. There are all kinds of groups of people who are interested in writing, who are writers that you might want to connect with. On Twitter and Instagram, there's a big community of writers. If you use the hashtags writers of Instagram on Instagram and on Twitter, writing community, writer's life, am writing, those are hashtags that I often use. You'll find other people like you who are looking to connect with writers and are looking for places to submit, are looking to see, how do you go through the process of getting published. When you're in a writing group like Canada Writes is one that I'm in, when you're with a community of writers like that, you can share your work with them. You can read what other people have written, and you can also see where other people are published. So I suggest that's a good thing to get connected with a lot of other writers as during the time that you're trying to find literary magazines to submit your work to. Okay, so to target your submissions, once you have your poetry ready, you have a bank of magazines available to submit to, then you're all set to do the submitting. So this is the important part. Now, of course, everyone wants to be published in the very best literary magazines, but I would suggest that if you're just striving for the very top, like the New Yorker, you're going to be disappointed. So submit to the best, certainly, but be willing to set your sights lower. Some online sites will organize magazines into tiers for you. So they're like first, second, third, and so on tier. The first being the most prestigious. Possibly they're organized by payment. The ones that are more prestigious might be paying magazines. They might have a higher circulation. They might have more awards and prizes that they nominate for. But of course, the first, second, and third are going to be the most difficult to get into. So you need to keep in mind that there are thousands of people who are submitting to these magazines for each issue. So that competition is really, really stiff. Some magazines will charge a fee for you to submit, a reading fee, although most of them are free. I don't usually submit to magazines that charge a fee, but that's your own personal decision. If you are paying a reading fee, then I think you should expect to have some sort of payment in return, even if it's a token payment. For contests that you might want to enter, you're probably going to pay a higher fee for that, but the money does go to the winners, along with the prestige of being selected and being published. So another way to go is to enter contests, and you'll find those in much the same way as you do searching for literary magazines to publish your work. You'll want to consider if you want your work published online or in print. Now, most of the magazines now are actually online. It's nice to actually have a magazine with, that you can get your hands on and say, hey, I'm in this, this is great. But most of them are online. And actually, I found that you can get a broader audience that way when it's available online. Look at the response time for each magazine. Some editors will respond right away within a few days, which is nice. But others honestly will take a year. I've waited 14 months for a response. So be ready to wait. Have a look at each magazine to see, they'll often tell you how long you can expect to wait. And I would check the demographics of each magazine. So you'll find in the About section, that's an important part to read. You'll find something about the magazine. Familiarize yourself with the type of work that they publish. Check out the masthead, who's putting out the magazine, the names of the editors. Is the style and theme of writing in that magazine something that fits with yours? So have a look at the magazine, see what are they publishing. Read some of the poetry there. Find out who their readers are, who are their writers. Find out how often they publish. And that's important as well, because the more issues that they put out, the more chance there is that your work is going to possibly be in there, because they're accepting more pieces per year. And getting your work out there is exactly what you want to do. So while we're all hoping to be chosen by the very top and the very best literary magazines, or we want to be paid a lot of money for our work, or we want to win a contest, we really need to set some realistic goals. So go ahead and submit to the New Yorker. But in the meantime, I would suggest that you get some publications under your belt. So seek out publications that are new, ones that are actively looking for work, as well as smaller publications. The less well-known or prestigious journals might be really happy to receive your submission. And don't expect to be paid, especially when you're starting out. Magazines that publish more frequently or publish more work in each issue are always a good option. You want to make friends with editors of magazines in your social media groups by liking and commenting on their posts, so that when you submit, they're going to recognize your name. One thing that's important is when you're submitting, don't submit to one place and wait forever, because as I said, you might be waiting 14 months and nobody has the time. We don't have time to sit around and wait 14 months to hear back that, no, thank you, your poem is not a fit for us. So cast a wide net. Unless, and this is important, I mentioned simultaneous submissions, that means that they won't allow you to submit to them and elsewhere at the same time. I don't usually submit to these places when they say no simultaneous submissions, but I have. It just means that you have to wait for a while before you submit that poem elsewhere. So it kind of puts it in limbo for a while. I would suggest maybe 3 or 4 magazines that you would submit a poem to at one time. I sometimes do 5 or 6, but it's important to track things, and we'll come to that later. Because if you don't track things, then you might end up in a position where someone has accepted your poem and then someone else comes along and says they would like to publish it as well, which is great, but it's embarrassing when you tell them that, sorry, it's no longer available for publication. Now, when you get a rejection, you're going to be ready to submit it elsewhere. You want to keep as many poems out there at once as you can, as many as you can track. When you achieve 10% of your poetry that you've submitted as accepted, I would say that's time to celebrate, because that means that you've been successful as a poet, as a writer. Now, once you've decided on your reason for publishing and your goals, and you have your list of places to submit, there are some things that you need to think about before submitting. So first of all, you want to make sure that you have enough poems to submit. Some magazines will ask for one, but that's not very common. Usually they'll ask for a group of poems that are on a particular theme. So have at least 1 or 6 poems, maybe more, ready to submit to a particular magazine at any time. The poems, of course, should be complete and edited. You don't want to submit the same work to the same magazine more than once, because if they've said no, this month, a couple months down the road, they're not going to all of a sudden say, hey, wow, we missed that. It was really great. We'd love to publish it now. So don't make that mistake of sending it again if they've rejected you. Most magazines want unpublished work, although some of them will take reprints. But that would be stated in their submission guidelines. So you need to make sure that you retain the rights to your work if it's already been published, and you need to credit the publication where your poems already appeared. So for example, if you have a poem called The Rain and it's already been published, you want to notify the magazine that you're submitting to that it's a reprint, The Rain, previously published in the Poetry magazine, April 2020. If you've posted your work in a blog or a media post or a website, then that's usually considered as being published, but not every magazine considers it published. So again, check out each individual magazine's guidelines. And of course, it has to be your own original work that you are submitting that you have the rights to. So when you're submitting, you're going to hear certain terms. Reprints is one of them. Reprints means that your poem has been published somewhere else already. So a few magazines will allow this if you tell them where and when it was published, and you retain the rights to republish your work. So if you've signed a contract, you want to read it carefully before republishing. Sometimes they will say that you can't have that poem published again for a year. When you're not sure of what rights you've given away, you can check online. So for instance, if you've given away your North American first rights, check online to make sure you understand the definition of what that means. Multiple submissions. This means that you have submitted more than one submission to a particular magazine at one time. So for instance, if you're sending 3 poems to the Poetry magazine, and then you decide, I want to send 3 more poems to the Poetry magazine, that's a multiple submission, doing it at the same time. Some magazines will allow that and some don't. So again, you need to check out their guidelines. Some magazines will specify that you can't submit again for a period of time if you are accepted. Now you can submit again during a new submission window, or you can wait a while after you've been rejected, but don't submit the same poem to the same magazine again, as I've said. And there are simultaneous submissions, which means sending a poem or poems to more than one magazine during the same time and waiting to hear back. So usually this is allowed, not always. Again, you want to check out each individual magazine's guidelines. If your work is accepted at a magazine and you have that poem or poems out with other magazines at the same time simultaneously, what's really important is that after you've accepted publication in that magazine, you want to notify your other magazines who still have your work that it's no longer available for publication. You don't want them wasting their time considering your work when it's no longer available. And you want to keep on good terms with those editors, because in the future, you're going to want to submit other poetry to them again. So how do you submit? Well, the process to submit for each particular magazine is spelled out under a tab that's called Writer's Guidelines, or Submissions, or Contribute. So you want to read and follow this word for word, because if you don't do that, you will get disqualified. You don't want to have your poems disqualified just because you didn't follow a few simple rules. The standard font is black 12-point times New Roman, unless it's been otherwise specified. You want a single space and justify to the left, unless they state that they accept unconventionally formatted poetry. And again, all this is in their guidelines. Title each poem, begin each one on a new page, and you want to insert a page break between each poem. Okay, so the guidelines for each magazine will tell you exactly what you can submit. They'll let you know whether you can submit reprints, previously published work that you hold the rights to, or simultaneous submissions, which means to other publications at the same time, or multiple submissions, which means you can send them more than one set of poetry, but in separate submissions at the same time. And they'll let you know how many poems you can and should submit at one time. They might ask you for a bio. or you can just choose to add it at the end of your cover letter anyway. I usually do that. Unless they say they don't want your bio until they have accepted you. So again, check the guidelines, but it's always good to have your bio ready. A photo, sometimes they'll ask for this. Usually you don't send it until you've been accepted. What you will need for sure, no matter what you do, is a short cover letter. So you want to let them know that you're submitting work for them to consider. Some magazines will ask you to send your work in an email. Others go through Submittable. And to use Submittable, you're going to need to set up an account, but it is free. So just Google Submittable. Or if you're looking at a particular magazine, the Submittable link will be right in there under the submission guidelines. So set up your free account. A magazine might also have its own forms for you to fill out. You need to check to see what type of files they accept. Is it doc or docs, PDF, RTF? Or they might ask you just to post your poem directly into the email. Find out how they want the file labeled. For example, you might label it as poetry submission with your name. Check to see what they want in the subject line of the email. For example, submission, poetry, your name, the titles. You want to make it clear that you're emailing to submit your work so that this doesn't get lost in the editor's inbox. Some magazines will want to judge your work anonymously on its own merit and not on your name or your bio. So they might ask you not to put your name on the file name or not to put your name on the submission itself, but only in your cover letter and your email address, of course. So I made that mistake one time. I guess I had my name in the file name or something, and I didn't realize that. So be really careful when they're saying they want to judge it anonymously. Be very careful what information you're sending them. So in the cover letter, you want to address the editor by name if you can, by first name. And you will find the editor's name usually in the About section, or there will be a heading called Masthead. You want to address them by the first name, for example, Dear Ivanka. Or if there are 2 or 3 editors, use all their names. But if it gets more than that, or it's you just can't find their name, you don't know what to call them, just say Dear Editors. Now, however you submit, whether it's through email or through their form that they have, or whether it's through Submittable, you're going to be sending a cover letter along with your submission. I usually just keep mine short and simple. Address the editor by their first name if possible. Let them know how many poems you're sending and their titles. State if it's for a particular issue or theme that they have a call out for. If there are any reprints there, if they allow them, then mention that and tell where and when they were published. If they want to know if the poems are being submitted simultaneously elsewhere, then tell them. If they've asked for your mailing address or your phone number, then provide that, and be sure to thank them. After your name and email, you can add your bio if you're asked for it, or you can choose to send it anyway, unless, as I said, they've specified that you don't do that. So I have an example of a short and sweet cover letter right there. Okay. So it's Dear name of editor or editors. Please consider the attached or the following 3 poems. You want to name them for whichever issue it is or whatever theme it is that you're submitting for, of whatever magazine it is. So it's very short, but you just want to let them know that you're submitting your work. Thank you in advance for your time and consideration. Sincerely, your name, your email address, and your bio. So that's as simple as it can be, and that's usually what I do. Remember, they're not publishing your letter, they're publishing your work. So their time is valuable. You don't need to waste it telling them everything about yourself in your letter. However, there are times when you're going to be asked to provide more information in your cover letter, or it might be your choice to personalize it a little bit. So what you could put then in the middle of your letter is, how did you find out about this magazine? Why are you submitting to them? It helps if you can relate to them on a personal level. So if you've read a poem in that magazine and you really enjoyed it, you want to mention that. And you can briefly state why your poetry fits in with their aesthetic or their style, or perhaps a theme that they have a call out for. Don't tell them what your poem's about, what your poetry is about, or summarize it. It should speak for itself. But rather, you could tell them what inspired you to write the poem, or where did you get the idea for the poem. I mentioned a bio. You want to have a bio ready at all times. You should have a short version and a longer one. I would keep the shorter one under 50 words and a longer one under 100. Keep those ready. You'll change them as needed. Some places will want a shorter one than that. Some will want a longer one. So again, look at the guidelines and go with every individual magazine and what they're looking for. Your bio should be in the third person, which I found a bit strange at first, but it sounds like this. Your bio is Ivanka is a Canadian writer. She, her. You're going to use your name and your pronouns. So you're talking about yourself as though you're someone else. And this is where you tell the publisher something interesting about yourself and your publishing credits, if you have any. You decide what you want to share about yourself with your reading audience. So who are you? Where were you born? You can tell something about your culture or your gender, something about you as a person, if you wish to share that, especially if it's reflected in your poetry, and especially if it reflects the type of work that the magazine publishes. So check the magazine's mission statement, read the poems that they publish, read the bios that go along with them to see if you fit in there. In your own bio, you might add, where do you live? A sentence or two about your job or profession, as well as your education and any degrees or certificates that you might have, and especially if those add to your credibility as a writer. If you were fortunate enough to get any awards or prizes and won any contests, then by all means mention that as well. But the problem is when you're starting out, of course, you have no publications to list. So what do you do if you have no previous publications and you have no relevant degrees? Well, that doesn't mean that you can't submit. When I first began submitting, of course, I didn't think anyone would want to publish any of my work. And I read other people's bios and I felt like I was a real imposter. I noticed that many of the people who contribute to literary magazines have a master's of fine arts and creative writing, or they write professionally, they've published books, or they've had hundreds of pieces of writing published in hundreds of journals. And I was a nobody in the publishing world when I started. But everybody has to start somewhere. So if this is your first publication, that's okay. When you're accepted, just go ahead and tell them that this will be my first published poem, which is always an exciting thing to share with everyone. So what do you say in your bio? Maybe you have nothing to say in the bio. Well, in your biography, you could tell some interesting things about yourself, such as how long have you been writing? What type of poetry do you write? You can tell something fun or funny about yourself. You can add your hobbies or your special interests. And let the editor and your readers get to know you a bit. Okay, so we come to record keeping, which is like the most boring part of writing for everyone, but it's really the most important part of it. So you need to keep track of who you send your work to. You want to keep track of what you sent and when you send it. You don't want to send the same piece to the same magazine twice. And you certainly don't want to get into a situation where you've been accepted by two magazines and you have to explain to one of them that, I'm sorry, but you may not publish my work because it's no longer available. So to avoid that, you need to keep really good records. You could do this if you're into spreadsheets, which I'm not. You could use Google or Microsoft spreadsheets. Some people have some really good setups with that. So it's really what you're comfortable with. Personally, I just use lists. I'm a real list person. So I have simple numbered lists. I have lists, all kinds of lists of things, and lists of my writing and where things go, where they go out and where they're published. I have probably 5 or 6 different lists. So however works for you, keep track of what you're sending out there. Okay, so what do you track? Well, first of all, you want to track the name of the publication you sent to, and if you know the country, that's great. Most of my work, I have chosen to submit my work to Canada, the US, and the UK. But of course, you can send your work out to magazines in any country that you wish. You want to keep track of the titles that you've submitted to each particular magazine. When you submitted it, is it simultaneous? Is it multiple or a reprint submission? Then you want to indicate, was it a rejection, an acceptance, or no response? And unfortunately, sometimes you will get no response. Record the expected date of publication if you are accepted. You can also organize your poems, which I do, just for yourself to keep track of things. So this can be a numbered list by date, written by theme, organized as part of a collection. As each poem is published, you can indicate it with a check mark. Keep a list of your publications and watch them grow. One thing I found really useful for me was in my lists, I would use the find replace function to search for a particular magazine or a particular piece to check and see what I submitted where, so I don't make that mistake of I sent that poem already to this place. So whatever works for you, as long as you are tracking your submissions somehow. Then getting a response. Well, waiting for a response can seem like it takes forever. Even if it's a few days, it can seem like forever. Some magazines will respond immediately, but unfortunately, most take a really long time. So if you get tired of waiting, you could send them an email just to inquire about the status of your submission. Their guidelines will tell you what to expect. They might say, well, we will get back to you in a few days. We'll get back to you in a few months. That will give you an idea, but I wouldn't nudge them before 3 months. If you don't receive a response at all and you're waiting and waiting, after a year, I would assume it's going to be a no or no response. Although, as I said, sometimes you do have to wait more than a year. What you're most likely to hear, though, is you are not a good fit. So when you hear that, accept it and move on. Submit it someplace else. It doesn't mean that it was a bad poem. Maybe it just didn't fit their style, or maybe their content, or maybe their theme. It just didn't fit. Like literally, it just didn't fit. Doesn't mean that they didn't like it. Or maybe they just had too many submissions for that particular issue. Maybe they had other things that fit in better. But your poem might be a perfect fit somewhere else. But after several rounds of submitting that poem to different magazines, you might want to consider editing or revising it again if it's not being accepted. I found that sometimes shortening it works for me. If you should happen to receive a personalized rejection with some nice comments or some constructive feedback, that means that you were really close. So consider that almost a win. Keep submitting and eventually you'll get there. So finally, getting that yes. That's what we all want to hear. So when you receive an email with an offer of publication, you want to celebrate that accomplishment because it really is a big deal. Acknowledge that you accept the offer by replying to the email. Thank the editor. You want to work on any edits that have been suggested, unless you feel it's really going to change the aesthetic of your poem, and then politely decline. I've never declined. Keep in mind that if an editor wants to suggest edits, they're taking the time to do that. It means that they like your work and they want to help you to make it better. So take advantage of their expertise. If you receive a contract, read it carefully, sign it, and return it to the publisher. There might be a period of time when you can't publish your work elsewhere. So if your contract specifies that you can't publish for a year or whatever, make sure that you are aware of that. There might be a payment that's promised as well in your contract. Often this is through PayPal. So if you don't have an account there and they are going to send you a payment, you might want to have that set up ahead of time, or definitely at the time when it's accepted for publication. Again, it's free to set this up. One important thing that I mentioned already is that if you are accepted, you want to notify the other publications who are still considering your poem that it's not available any longer. And you want to apologize for the inconvenience and leave the door open for future submissions. Okay, going back now. Okay, so you followed me through to bio there. Okay, so the no publication credits, so I'll just bring them up again so you can read through yourself. Okay, so now once you have been published as a poet, what comes next? So do you want to further your writing hobby or share more of your work? Make a career out of it possibly. Okay, so you want to consider what you were considering at the start. What was your goal as a writer? And what's your goal now? If you want to pursue publishing further, you should know when the rights to your published work reverts back to you so you can publish reprints of your work elsewhere. So familiarize yourself with those terms like first North American rights and others by searching online for the definitions. You could create your own website to post your work, get involved in social media if you haven't already done so, post your work there, post links to it there. If you want to write a book of poetry, organize your poems in a themed collection and send it to publishers. So this can be short, like a chapbook or a full book collection. You'll find chapbook publishers by searching online, much as you did with publishers of magazines. Another option is you can self-publish a poetry book on Amazon through Kindle publishing at no cost, simply by following the instructions to upload and publish your book. You might wish to try a different type of writing, for example, short fiction. Flash fiction is always a good transition from poetry to not poetry, so flash fiction, nonfiction writing possibly. You just go through the submission process just the same way as you did with poetry. If you are really ambitious, you may wish to write a novel or a nonfiction book. And the process for that is similar to what you're doing with submitting to magazines, but there's a little bit more to it. But that experience that you have in submitting to magazines will prove really useful when you're trying to send queries and summaries and samples of your work out to book publishers. Also, your experience in submitting to magazines will prove to be really useful if you're hoping to pursue a writing career in some other way. So that concludes it for me. To summarize it, I would say if you want to publish your poetry, you need to read published poems. Then you need to write and edit your own collection of poetry. Search online for magazines to submit your work to. Search for those sites that give you lists of magazines to submit to. Look at places like Submittable, Submission Grimer, Duotrope. Send your work out to many magazines, carefully following the posted guidelines. So that's the really important thing, is to follow each magazine's individual guidelines. And as you continue that process, you're going to do more research, find out more about writing poetry, find out more about submitting poetry, and more about publishing. There's a lot of information online about literary magazines and journals and about contests. There are a lot of social media groups that you can connect with other authors or other writers and other editors there. But I think that the best advice I can give you is to persevere. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to get your work published. But sometimes, to be honest, it's just a matter of luck. So I wish you good luck. It's a matter of having that right piece at the right time to the right magazine. So good luck and happy publishing. So if anyone has any questions, I'm open to go back to anything that you might have missed there, or to dig a little bit deeper. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. In the bio, you're talking about giving publishing credits and that. If you're submitting poetry, but most of your publication credits have been in other fields, should that still be mentioned, or focus only on your poetry publications?
No, I would mention that. I would mention anything that you've had published because it all validates you as a writer, whether it's a poem or whether it's a piece of fiction or if it's an article. It doesn't matter. It still shows that your writing is good enough that someone has published you. So yes, I would list any place that you've been published. It gets to a point though where your publication credits might be really, really long. So then at that point, I would choose the ones that you feel are most important for that particular magazine that you're submitting to.
Okay, thank you.
So in the chat, there's a question, and unfortunately that's all we're gonna have time for. But in your experience, do you typically retain the rights to your poems, or do the journals or publications claim your rights when you're published?
You almost always retain the rights to your work. It's your work. It's copyrighted. When you write it, it's copyrighted. It's your work. The only thing is if you have signed, and they will specify this, each magazine will specify this, that you can't, they don't want you to publish it elsewhere within a certain amount of time, maybe, or especially if you've signed a contract, read that carefully, but you always retain the rights to your own work. It just might be a matter of when can you publish it next.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on your publishing deal. 5-book deal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, thank you.
That's pretty exciting. People can find you at Fear Ivanka is your username on Twitter and Instagram, I think, is it?
On Twitter, it's
On Twitter.
Fear Ivanka. It's Ivanka Writes on Instagram. Or you can look up my Facebook. I have an author Facebook page as well, and a website where if you're interested in seeing different places where I have submitted and have had success, I do have those places listed on my website.